this hour is open Q&A. So I'm at your service. I can't reveal tomorrow's closing Dow Jones Industrials. That's privileged information. But I'm trained in philosophy. Philosophy of mathematics was my field. Philosophy of science and Jewish subjects. Anything in that general area that's on your minds, if you have a question, I'll try to answer it.
Great. Do it right now?
Yeah. With whatever you like.
Talk a little bit about Nietzsche if you want.
A little bit.
A little bit.
I studied and I taught Anglo-Saxon philosophy. And
Okay.
Nietzsche is continental
Sure.
philosophy.
Yeah.
But I taught at Johns Hopkins. We had a very small department. There were only 10 members of the department. So when someone wrote a thesis, we had to double up. And I co-directed a thesis on Nietzsche. And I said to the student, that's what he was specializing in, I would like you to find for me one argument with reasonably persuasive premises and good logic to a conclusion that isn't obvious. An argument that would establish something, would compel consent because it was logical. Just one, in the whole of Nietzsche's corpus. Couldn't find one. Couldn't find one. Nietzsche is a great poet. He writes with great passion and great enthusiasm. And much of what he writes, if you ask what exactly is he saying, it's very hard to pin down. So it's thrilling to read, but to come away with a piece of reasoning that might convince somebody who wasn't predisposed to be impressed.
Well, what he writes is it's like a stream of consciousness almost, on
Right.
like the inner workings of human minds and such.
Or his mind and such.
Yeah.
And either you find it matches the way you look at the world or it doesn't. Okay, that's important. It's a contribution of a stream of consciousness. But if you're looking for somebody to teach you something you didn't know, teach you something new, introduce you to something which you might resist, but then discover that you were prejudiced and really he's got something true to offer you, there's next to nothing there. Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher whom I have a great deal of respect, wrote an essay on Nietzsche, and he came to the same conclusion, though he did explain what he was trying to get at, but if it doesn't appeal to you, there's nothing to say. The kind of studies that I did are to find things which might be true even if they don't appeal to you, even if you're initially opposed.
Such as something like Wittgenstein or something?
Well, for example, till 1965, the whole of the educated world believed the universe has no beginning. Einstein believed that so much that when he concocted general relativity, and according to his equations, the universe as a whole could be changing, he fudged them. He stuck in a fudge factor called the cosmological constant, so as to make sure everything stays constant, because he couldn't grasp an idea like that. That was an idea that everybody was against, that the universe as a whole could be changing. 1965, they were forced to accept it because of certain empirical findings, and a credit to the scientific world that they gave up what they believed in and what they loved, because there are certain observations they couldn't make sense out of. So that's an example of learning something which is against the grain, something you don't want to hear. Stephen Hawking writes, a beginning of the universe smacks of a creator, and we as scientists are against that. To his credit, he, like everybody else in 1965, had to admit that the universe has a beginning. That's what I'm talking about, something that you don't like, you don't want, you're against, but something compels you to accept it because there's good reason to accept it. Not only did I find that in Nietzsche, but I was just dabbling. I asked people who study Nietzsche, and they said, you can't find anything like that. Either you're naturally inclined to go down his path, and then he gives you a lovely description of the path. If you're not naturally inclined, he gives you no reason to go down that path. The whole of Western ethics is worthless. transvaluation of values, the Superman who's above conventional morality and all the rest of that. As we say in Hebrew, Oshikenu Shalom. I mean, maybe yes, maybe no. Can you give me a reason for thinking that? No, I'll just give you a very dramatic description of how it
He does
might be.
give a genealogy throughout history of how it comes to certain points. He traces religion. Genealogy of morality is one of his...
Genealogy of Morals is the name of the book, right? But he doesn't give any reason for thinking his genealogy is correct. He doesn't consider any alternatives. There are lots of other alternatives as to the way in which these things developed. Number one. And number two, there's something well recognized in Western philosophy called the genetic fallacy. The fact that a certain item originated in a certain way doesn't tell you what its validity is today. You probably learned arithmetic from a third grade teacher. And you probably learned it because you wanted to please the teacher and get a good grade, and get lollipops from your parents and so forth and so on. I hope that arithmetic isn't for you today as a mature adult what it was for you when you were 8 trying to please your teachers. The fact that that's where it came from doesn't mean that that's what its validity is today. That's called the genetic fallacy. So to chase the genealogy of morals doesn't say much about what its validity is today. Evolutionists try to do the same thing. Believing in moral rules helped keep the group together and helped cooperation and helped beat the saber-toothed tiger and so forth and so on. Okay, it has an evolutionary origin. Then they say, so therefore it has no real validity, has no real truth. Well, let me ask you, how about arithmetic? Didn't arithmetic have an evolutionary origin? Didn't everything, according to them, have an evolutionary origin? So then arithmetic can't be true either, because it just helped people pass on their genes. How about science? Isn't the impulse to science also something that was developed through evolution? Sure. So then science can't be objectively true either? I mean, it washes out because it applies equally to everything. It applies equally to everything, then it has no purchase. And so the genealogy of morals, number one, he doesn't consider alternatives. He doesn't argue on the basis of historical evidence and on the basis of considering alternatives why his genealogy should be accepted and others not. It's just a genealogy that serves his ideological purposes. If his genealogy were true, then you could draw the conclusion that the morals have no objective validity. That's his purpose, but that's not an objective way to go about it, to consider the other person's position and show why yours is better than his. And secondly, if it's just a question of genealogy, that doesn't show it has no objective purpose. Arithmetic has a genealogy also. Doesn't show it has no objective truth. So that's the standard response to that kind of study. So as I say, if you're inclined to walk down that path, if you're naturally inclined towards the ideas that he's expressing, you find him a very eloquent spokesman, but that's not rational persuasion. It's not argument.
So his ideas on the genealogy of morals is not that it's some dialysis of ideas, like a Hegelian model where you have like a
thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis.
Rather, it's just random wills to power that we see order within the synthesis, when in reality there is no order. It's just like individual wills to power colliding, and out of that we see some genealogy or some like linear movement. Mm-hmm. So that's what his idea of genealogy. Okay.
Right? Now suppose I say that people have they experience in childhood the virtues of cooperation, and they experience the terrible destructiveness of competition, and they learn that important projects are done through cooperation, and that's where it comes from. Not a will to power, not a will to dominate anybody else, but on the contrary, seeing that cooperation gets you very positive results.
But whom did they learn that from? They learned that from their
other
parents,
people.
Authority figures?
No, they learned it from experience. When all the kids are fighting for the toy, nobody gets to play with it. When they take turns, then everybody gets to play with it.
But not only experience, they learn it from the experience of the children whom they're playing with.
Correct.
So those are the children exerting their wills to power on each other.
That's the assumption. I say no. They're not exerting their wills to power. They just, from experience, they learn that when you share things, you get more out of life rather than exerting power, the will to power. Let's say traffic laws, right? Traffic laws are very tyrannical. 50% of the road is forbidden to you by law. 50% of the road. Wouldn't it be freer to let everybody drive any way he wants? The only thing is, no one will get anywhere. If you have only one-way traffic, 50% of the road is off limits, but on the 50% that's going your direction, everybody travels. So is that a will to power, or is that an agreement to cooperate? Sounds to me like an agreement to cooperate. So I have a different genealogy. My genealogy is from the perceived efficiency of cooperation. Now, does he have anything in his book to say that I'm wrong? How does he show that I'm wrong?
Well, he fits it into his general worldview.
Yes, he does. That's self-verifying. I have my worldview and I have my genealogy. It fits into my worldview. I've created my little ship, and my little ship holds water, but there are a lot of other ships on the sea. Who says your sail's better than anybody else's? He doesn't even consider that. He just expresses his point of view in a very dramatic way. That's not what I call searching for the truth. That's not what I call putting forth a reason to believe that what you say is true. It's just a way of expressing, for a person who already is inclined to believe to agree with you, expressing his point of view in a dramatic way. I was taught to do philosophy as a search for the truth, not just, poetry. And poetry is wonderful, but label it poetry. Tell me it's poetry, and don't try to pretend to me that you're giving me a reason to change my mind to agree with you. I don't see any reasons there at all. It's a little bit like a Western prejudice which has crept into psychology. You read any child psychology, very important concept is the concept of maturity. Now, the word maturity in English is one of those words that has built-in values. Maturity is good, and immaturity is bad. Call a person immature and you're insulting him. So when you in your psychology say maturity is X, implicitly what you're doing is you're giving a stamp of approval to X. By the very fact that you identify maturity as X, you're saying X is good. Okay, in the current Western culture, maturity is identified with individuality, independence, and autonomy. I stand on my own. I live by my own conscience. I judge myself by the bar of my own values. Other people's judgments can't bind me. Other people's judgments aren't relevant for the true value of my life or my actions. Only I and my values count. One of the ways they express this is by contrasting shame and guilt. Shame is public, is social. Shame is what you feel in front of somebody else whose opinion you're afraid of. Guilt is what you feel when you stand in front of the mirror and you say, did I do well or didn't I do well? No, I didn't do well. Guilt is autonomous, it's self-evaluation. In the current Western thinking, maturity is identified with autonomy. A person who's still worried about what other people think about him is not mature. He's still childish. Children are overly worried about what other people will think. Mature adults take their own stand, their own independent stand. Is that necessarily correct, right, true, valid, real? Aristotle taught that man by his very nature is social, that your identity is determined by the place you play in society. Detach a person from society and he's not human. After all, when you ask yourself, what am I? A lot of the answer is, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm a citizen, I'm a neighbor. All those are relationships. All those are relationships. Your age, I'm a child of my parents. All those are relationships. You speak a language. A language is a community-wide convention. Whether you speak correctly or not depends upon the rules by which the society speaks the language. No one can tell you how to speak. You can say whatever you like, but you can't communicate by saying whatever you like. You can only communicate if you speak by the rules that everybody else abides by. I could say and plus blue. I can say that, but I can't communicate because that doesn't follow the rules that everybody else uses and uses in the language. So Aristotle said, man by his very nature is social. Aristotle would say, if you think you're an individual, if you're really autonomous, if you stand only at the bar of your own conscience, you're utterly childish. You haven't grown up. You don't realize that your essential identity is tied up with the role you play in society. So now Aristotle has an entirely different view of what maturity is. Anything in modern philosophy or psychology argue that Aristotle's wrong? Give me a reason to think he's wrong? It's just a mental set which we become accustomed to, and it has certain value and it has certain drawbacks, and we're used to it and we just take it for granted. I, as a philosopher, want to know, is there a reason to accept that? Is it just a prejudice? Is it just arbitrary for our time in history? 100 years from now it'll be different, 100 years before it was different? Nothing in the psychology book will tell you anything about that. It just expresses the current prejudices. This, as a philosopher, I want to get behind all that. I don't want to just follow, just be told by CNN what I'm supposed to believe and what I'm supposed to value. I like to have reasons for what I do. That's what philosophy is all about, in my view. It's about reasons. Nietzsche didn't have any. He just expressed his point of view in a very vivid way. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, run by Stanford University. It's a very excellent online, free resource of articles in philosophy written by top experts. And I read through the article on Nietzsche, and the author there came to the exact same conclusion. There's nothing in Nietzsche to provide a reasoned argument to a conclusion which would give you a reason to change your mind, to say, yeah, I missed something, what I've been thinking was wrong, I've missed out a fact or a piece of reality, and Nietzsche has revealed to me that I'm making a mistake, I have to change my mind.
I think that's part of his point, though. Not to contradict, but part of his point is that there is no objective truth, that most experiences and realities are subjective. And so he even disputes a lot of like scientific evidence.
Yeah. So now let me just...
I know what you're going to say, it fits within.
No, but I just want to pin down exactly what you mean. You started with there's no objective truth, and you said most experiences are subjective. So you mean none or most?
All experience, that's what Nietzsche says. He says that everything is subjective. And
Does that include his theory?
Yeah, he admits that in the very beginning. He says, yeah, it includes my theory that it's subjective. So,
but then there's...
Yeah, it's a contradiction.
Sure, it's a contradiction. Okay, no, very good. But now, if you want to talk to me, you have to use language that I can understand. Okay. If you contradict yourself and admit that it's a paradox, then why are you talking to me? Why should I listen? I was like, I had a fellow, I go to South Africa often enough. A few years ago, I was there, and somebody said to me, Rabbi, what are you trying to do? You're trying to use reason to convince me that the Jewish tradition is valid. But don't you know that reason is just a Western cultural form? It's just something that you do in the West. It doesn't have universal validity. It's not something that's done everywhere the same. And he said, and don't use reason to answer me, because that's begging the question. Fortunately, I had read a wonderful book by Thomas Nagel a few months before, so I said to him, let me ask you, are you trying to give me a reason to doubt reason or not? If you're trying to give me a reason to doubt reason, then I can surely use reason to answer you. And if you're not trying to give me a reason, why should I listen to you? Go play the saxophone and leave me alone. Why should I listen to you if you're not trying to give me a reason? What are you trying to do? Browbeat me? Persuade me? Inject me with drugs? Either you're giving me a reason, or why should I listen to you? And if you're giving me a reason, I can certainly use reason to answer you. Certain things are inescapable. Reason is a presupposition of discourse. If you're talking to somebody else, having a discussion, trying to get at a better or worse way to look at things, then reason is what you are using. So you just can't step out of it. And to say, sure, I told you you can, and I know you can't, and I'm just talking in paradoxes, then why should I listen to you? You're talking in paradoxes. Go write poetry for a poetry journal. Don't talk to me about what I should think, what I should believe. He certainly didn't write his books as if it's all free, and if you oppose me, you're just as good as agreeing with me, because there's no difference between you and me. He didn't write his books that way. He wrote his books with a passion that he's giving something to the world which should make over the way people think, and should become the new way people think. And if all he can say is that everything is subjective, and therefore it makes no difference how you think, then there's no point in reading his book, unless, as I said at the beginning, you happen to agree with him by temperament, and then he has a very powerful way of expressing what you already believe. And that could very well be the case. Not, as you can see, I'm not, from my point of view, my purposes in life, I'm not very much impressed. I'll give you an example of establishing something for somebody who was initially opposed to it. Our tradition has two parts, a written and an oral. The Talmud tells a story of a non-Jew who came to Hillel and said to him, I'm interested in converting, but I don't want to hear about the oral. Not interested. I just want to study what's written, which in that time was only the Bible. There was nothing else at that time. So Hillel said, fine. Let's start with the letters of the alphabet. The first day he taught him the first four letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. He said to him, go home and memorize that. Tomorrow, come back for the next lesson. Comes back the next day, and Hillel says, let's review. Points to an Aleph and says, what's that? And the non-Jew says, Aleph. Hillel says, no, that's a Dalet. Points to the Bet. He says, what's that? The non-Jew says, it's Bet. Bet. And Hillel says, no, it's Gimel. So the non-Jew says, what are you talking about? Come on, it was only four letters. I remember four letters. I know what they were, what you said yesterday. Oh, says Hillel. So you have to learn the letters from me. Then asking for the written without the oral makes no sense. That's the story. As is the case very often in the Talmud, a deep philosophical idea is clothed in a very simple story. Let's see, written information. Let's suppose I have paper with ink splotches on it. What makes those ink splotches information rather than just decorative designs? Isn't it that there's a group of people who can tell you what those ink splotches say, can tell you what they mean? Isn't it because that pattern of ink on paper is embedded in a culture of people who can explain to you in words what it means? If you don't have those ink splotches embedded in such a culture, they don't have any information. Maybe you've heard of the Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone was discovered some 2,000 more years ago, and it had markings on it. From what people knew about ancient languages, it looked like some ancient language, but the entire community that produced it was unknown, and it died out thousands of years ago, and therefore no one had a clue what it meant. And for decades, nobody had a clue what it meant. And when they finally cracked it, the way they cracked it was they noticed a correspondence between the markings on the Rosetta Stone and ancient Greek. So what they ended up doing was pairing off the letters to ancient Greek. And then, since we have people who've spoken Greek continuously since then, we know what the Greek means, and that way they figured out what the Rosetta Stone means. So the idea of written information without oral is a non-idea. There is no such thing. The written leans on a community that can explain it orally. Without that, why is this T-A-B-L-E and those little creatures outside C-A-T? Why isn't this cat? And why aren't they tables? Because people tell you that's what table means and that's what cat means. Without that, there's no information at all. Now here was a non-Jew who was convinced he wanted only the written. Hillel showed him that what he was asking for is a zero. It's an absurdity. There is no such thing as written information without an oral information, an oral culture that can orally explain to you what the written means. And that means all written leans on oral. Without oral, there's no information there at all. I think that's a very important point. And that's what I mean by learning something you weren't inclined to accept, you had feelings against, and then being presented with a reason and saying, well, I have to change what I think because, this isn't what I thought. Another example, which I think also is very important. Many people feel that rules restrict them. Rules cut down their freedom, hamper their freedom. Rules say you must do this, or you can only this, you can't do that. Rules limit you in certain ways. I think that's true, but I think it's a half-truth. Because I think also rules create alternatives that you wouldn't otherwise have. They give you, in a certain sense, freedoms that you wouldn't otherwise have. Here's my example. I'm playing chess with someone. Middle of the game, I take my knight, and I move it straight forward 3 spaces, and I take off his queen. He says, you can't do that. I said, I can't? Watch, I'll do it again. 1, 2, 3, off with your queen. Of course I can do that. Very easy. He says, yeah, but that's not chess. That's not how the knight moves. then I move like an L, 2 spaces and 1. It doesn't move 3 spaces straight forward. Nobody tells me how to move. Nobody tells me what to do. I'm a free bird. I move my pieces anywhere I like. Okay, you can do that, but then you can't play chess. You've lost the opportunity to play chess if you're going to move your pieces any way you like. Following the rules of chess make it possible to play a chess game. Otherwise, you can't play a chess game. You can't. You've lost that alternative if you don't play by the rules. Exactly what I said before about communication. True, no one can tell you how to speak. But we can tell you, if you don't follow these rules, you can't communicate. Because this is the way everybody else communicates with the language. If you don't follow those rules, no one will understand you. If they don't understand you, you're not communicating. So following the rules of language make it possible to communicate. Communicating is pretty important. It's pretty important. Friendships and business relationships and politics and all depend upon communicating. So the rules of language, which are very restrictive, out of the almost infinite combinations you can have in language, only a very, very vanishingly small percentage suffice for communication. The rules are very restrictive, but they make possible communicating. So rules have a creative impact on your freedom, as well as a restrictive. Both are true. They restrict, but they also create alternatives that you wouldn't otherwise have. I think when you realize that, you look at rules in a different way. You don't just look for more room to maneuver and less rules to be restrictive. You look for the rules that will create opportunities that are meaningful. I was a musician. I played classical music for many years. You want to play Beethoven, you have to play the notes on the score. And you want to play Beethoven in an orchestra, then the conductor will say, this is what I want to achieve with this piece, with this movement, and this is how it has to be done. Here's where it begins, here's where it develops, here's where the exclamation is, and the high point, and here's where it's recapitulation, and he'll tell you how to modify the volume, the dynamics. If you want to play gifted music with other people, you have to do it according to the rules that everybody's following to get a coordinated joint effect. What about football? Football, I got 11 guys on the field, and they got to pull a play. So the quarterback says, end run. Okay, then the blockers have to be here, and the halfback has to be there, and the fullback has to be there, and you have to hand it off to someone on the side, and he has to run around. They have to curve to cut the blocker. It has to be coordinated. One guy says, nobody tells me how to run. I run as I like. I run anywhere I like. Okay, but then you can't play football. Your plays won't run. You want to have a good football team, it has to be run according to the way in which the plays are structured and practiced. Otherwise, you lose the games. So rules have this double function. Once you realize that, I think you look at rules differently, and you examine the rules that exist and ask yourself, what value do these rules have? What functions do these rules provide? What do they make possible? Is it worthwhile? And if it is worthwhile, then you support the rules. And if it's restricted without any benefit, then you may oppose the rules. But at least now you have a more balanced picture of how to look at rules, instead of simply saying, rules take away my freedom, so I'm against all rules, which is, I think, at a certain age, in a certain stage, in a certain environment, is the dominant feeling that, rules are just a way for the society to enforce its will on me and to stop me from doing what I want to do. I think that's a narrow, one-sided view of the way rules actually function. This is the kind of thing I was looking for in Nietzsche. An argument to a conclusion that people would be initially inclined to resist, and then give them reason to say, no, you should change your mind, because here are considerations that show you that you've missed something important, and take into account the other guy's point of view and say, look, you hold this, and this is the way you look at things. I hold this, and for this reason, mine's superior to yours. And that's argument and reason.
What about like the rules of kashrut? How would you fit that into the idea expressed?
Okay, now this is it's a very fundamental question. It's a very important question. Rules are valuable in a certain context. And they may not be valuable in another context. In an operating theater, the surgeon will always place his instruments into a disinfectant before when he's not using them. When he goes to cut, he'll use it, and then he'll wash it off, and he'll put it back in the disinfectant. You don't have to do that at home. Why not? Well, in surgery, a person's body's open. Anything that's contagious will get to the internal of the body without the body's natural defenses, and he'll be in serious danger. Your body isn't open to infection in your kitchen. It's the way it is in an operating theater. So you have rules for the operating theater, which are different than the rules for the kitchen. First question you have to ask when you come across a set of rules is, what's the environment in which these rules are being applied? Now we come to a biggie. Jewish rules are employed in the environment of a creator who's running the universe hands-on. That's the key environment in which these rules operate. Someone who doesn't believe in that is going to find the rules very difficult to justify. The rules aren't valuable for someone who's missing out on half the reality. He can't see why they're valuable. They're not meant to be valuable under those conditions. If somebody says, I'm an atheist, convince me that why I should keep kosher, I would say, you set up a hopeless task. If I didn't believe in God, I wouldn't keep kosher either. Why should I do that? I just happen to believe that there's a creator who's running history, running the world, and he laid down these rules. That's reason enough for me to say that it's important to follow them. So, to justify them outside of the system is something which very often can't be done. Sometimes there are secondary effects that can be done, some things you can do, improve your marriage, or improve your health, and so forth and so on. You can do that. But it's really a bit of a cheat, because Jewish rules of husband and wife relations are not designed to improve marriages. It's not Jewish self-help, Jewish pop psychology. It's how the Creator wants us to live. And He has His reasons. And we're not always privy to His reasons. So I can tell you that the Creator who designed the human body and who created all of the foods of the world and who created the laws of biochemistry and physiology, He's telling us these are the things that we need to eat. That authority is enough for me to understand that it's appropriate to do. But to transfer it outside the system, number one, it's often hard, and number two, even when you can do it, it doesn't hit the essence of the system. So it's sort of like asking a surgeon, why do you do surgery? And suppose he says, I make a real good living. I make a lot of money doing surgery. Now that might be true. He might be making a lot of money. It might very well not be his purpose for doing surgery. He may feel that people are suffering. He may feel that he has gifted hands and gifted strength and gifted focus. And he can do surgery in a way that's really very superior. And therefore he can do great good for people. So he does, of course he charges money. He has a right to live. You might even say he has a right to live well. But that's not why he's doing it. So someone who says, but are you earning money? Is missing the point. Yes, I'm earning money, but that's not the point of surgery. The point of surgery is to improve people's health. Similarly, too, if there's a mitzvah which contributes to the happiness in your marriage or contributes to your physical health, it may do that. But that's not the ultimate reason. The ultimate reason is that the Creator of the universe, who's running the world hands-on, says, this is what I want for you. I'm telling you this as an act of love for your ultimate good. That being the case, that's the reason for doing it. Not because I happen to make money or, benefit in local ways.
Here in Israel, there's so many different levels of kashrut that it's confusing, like which one to get, things like that.
There are different levels. The different levels come about, well, there's several ways, but let me give you an illustration of how they come about. The question is whether this object, this item, this process is kosher or not. sometimes it's controversial, whether it's kosher or not. Now, we have rules for resolving controversies. If it's a matter of central importance, what we call a Torah issue, going back to God's revelation, then in any controversy we have to be strict. If it's rabbinic, then we're allowed to be lenient. Let's imagine that it's a rabbinic issue. And let's say there's a split. Since there's a split, you're allowed to be lenient. You're allowed to be lenient. Anyone who's lenient cannot be criticized. But it's praiseworthy to accept upon yourself a higher standard. So here's a point where a person can volunteer for a higher standard. Now, some of the kashrut certifications stick by the strict letter of the law. They want it to be kosher and period, just kosher. If that's your standard, that's what you want, there are kosher certifications that will deliver that for you. Then there are people who want that voluntarily higher standard. They want that. They've opted for that. So then they will choose a different kashrut certification because that kashrut certification says we know there are people who want this higher standard and we're providing it for them. So then you learn what the standards are for each organization and then you ask yourself, where do I fit? How far is my commitment to kashrut go? Does it stop at the minimum level of doing the right law, or do I want to take on for myself extra stringencies? That's one of the reasons why there's a variety of different certifications, because they have different levels of optional addition to the standards that you want to keep. And I think that's a good thing. By the way, I've often heard a critique of a rabbi who certifies the kashrut, let's say, of a restaurant, but who won't eat there. And the critique is, if you don't eat it, then you don't trust it. If you don't trust it, why are you certifying it for other people? But I just gave you the answer. He's certifying it for people who want a kosher but lower standard than he personally keeps. I have met rabbis who don't eat outside their own home, period. Nobody else has to do that. That's their standard. So when he certifies a restaurant, he says, I know what your standards are. I've publicized the standards up to which I'm giving certification. If these meet your standards, I'm telling you this restaurant is okay for you. The fact that I won't eat there has nothing to do with whether it's appropriate for you. There's no contradiction in saying I have much stricter standards for myself. For other people, I have acceptable standards, but not as strict as my own. That happens a lot, especially when somebody comes to ask a question about what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. Many, many authorities will not impose their own very strict standards on the public. Indeed, the Talmud tells a story about a certain student who wanted to know the law on a certain subject, and instead of asking the rabbi, he went to ask the rabbi's wife what the rabbi did in the house. So they asked him, why did you do that? Why didn't you ask the rabbi? He said, because I know he wants to be lenient for me. He wants to make things easy for me. I want to know what he does. He won't tell me if I ask him what he does, he won't tell me. So I went and asked his wife. She told me what he does. And now I know what he does, and that's what I want to do. Because he wanted the stringency. And he was afraid that his teacher wouldn't give it to him. But that shows you the alternate standards that people have. And it's fully appropriate to have alternate standards. As long as the standard you give for other people is, legally speaking, an acceptable standard.
Here there's just so much more different standards than in America. It's like, oh, you.
Well, for one thing, I don't know how much you know, there's a book that comes out every year in America with something like 150 different kashrut certifications, with the symbols and who's behind it and basically what their standards are, but most of them are local. Now, Israel is just one town, it's just one club, and the kashrut symbols tend to be all over. But it's exactly the same thing here. And here, by the way, there are more things to worry about because the agricultural laws apply in Israel, don't apply outside Israel. So there's quite a number of different issues that apply to food here that don't apply outside the land of Israel. Where it gets tricky is where Israel exports, and they do export. And it's especially tricky in Europe where importers will not label it as Israeli produce because the prejudice against Israel in Europe is so great that either people won't buy or they'll firebomb the store. So they don't label it as Israeli, they say Middle East or something like that. And the Jewish buyer doesn't know it's coming from Israel, and the Jewish buyer doesn't know that it might have agricultural issues, and then they run into difficulty that way. And there are publications which say, we shipped so and so many tons of avocados to Spain this last month, and so forth and so on. So people in Spain can know that this is where the stuff is coming from. But locally grown in outside the land of Israel, the agricultural laws don't apply. Almost all of them don't apply. So that means there's much less to worry about in kashrus. But then you have food chemistry. Food chemistry is vast. Today, normal food items have at least dozens of ingredients, and sometimes more, because the paprika that you use is itself composed of 6 different ingredients, which come from 6 different sources, and then ground together. And that all has to be traced back. And you need people who are trained in chemistry to know if it's cooked at this temperature, if it's cooked with a liquid, without a liquid, will it denature? All these things have to be taken into account. And there are experts who do that. I had a friend a million years ago, when I was living in Boston. He came to MIT, and he studied chemistry, got a doctorate. He never got a mark lower than 90 in any test that he ever took. Straight A student. He became the kashrut coordinator for the OU in Europe. Travels all over Europe to investigate plants, to look at their formulas, to look at their sources, and because he's an expert in chemistry, he's able to handle that. He also happens to be a Belzer Chassid. A Chassid of one of the really ultra-Orthodox Hasidic texts. And the fact that he's a doctor from MIT doesn't hamper him at all. They all respect him, and they all understand that he's making a very important contribution. That's just to perhaps loosen up another common stereotype. Kashrut is a very difficult study. You also have to be something of a detective, because often enough, people don't want to comply. They find that they're being taxed, and subconsciously they resent being taxed. Of course, the tax here is just like advertising. It increases your revenue because it increases your market. But sometimes they find it hard to accept that, especially someone who lives, let's say, in the Midwestern United States, has no contact with Jews, there aren't any Jews within 500 miles, and he's told, yeah, but it's going to go to a processing plant in St. Louis, and from there it's going to go to Chicago for finishing, and from there it's going to be shipped to Minnesota, and Minnesota is going to send it to upstate New York, and there are a lot of Jews in upstate New York, so you better get a kashrut symbol on your thing. So, God, 5 stages down the road, and I'm sitting over here in Iowa, and I have to. But yeah, you want to increase your market. That's what you have to do. You have to please the consumer. That's the name of a free market.